She had found it 3 weeks ago on his writing desk, face down, weighted with the seal press. She had touched the corner of the page without meaning to, and felt the specific quality of finality in it. The way you feel cold through glass before you open the window. She had not read it. She had walked out of the study and spent 3 weeks preparing to survive what it contained. She was not prepared. The assembly hall held 200 witnesses. He stood at the head table and did not look at her. She stood at the center of the hall in the position she had been formally directed to occupy, equidistant from the 4 witnessing pillars, visible from every seat. He began to read. The words were formal and precise and said nothing about what they were actually doing. Then the bond broke. Not cleanly. It tore, the way things tear when they are not ready to be separated. And the ragged edge lodged in her chest like something unfinished. And then the wave hit. Every damaged bond in the kingdom arrived simultaneously. Thousands of them, each one specific, each one located. Each one a particular and private wound filling her awareness completely and beyond completely. She had no preparation for this. The hall floor came up to meet her. Above her, in the cadence of a memorized text, he was still reading. He did not stop. She lay on the cold stone and felt the weight of the kingdom's hidden suffering and thought. She had always known the cost of loving someone who would not look at you. She simply had not known how many others knew it too. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. She woke on the 3rd day. The room was small and gray-walled, a border holding at the edge of the kingdom's southern administrative territory. Functional, clean, entirely without the vocabulary of comfort. Someone had placed a blanket over her and a cup of water on the table beside the pallet. And the someone had been careful and quiet about it, which told her it was not a guard but a person. She had been unconscious for 3 days. She knew this the way she knew everything now, not because anyone told her, but because the knowledge was simply present. The way the knowledge of every damaged bond in the kingdom was present. Vast and specific and entirely without her consent. That was the first thing she became fully aware of, before the room, before her own body. Before the particular ache in her chest where the bond's ragged edge lived like a splinter too deep to reach. She knew everything. Not everything in the abstract sense of an overwhelming flood. The flood had already happened. Had filled and organized itself during the 3 days of unconsciousness into something that was no longer a wave but a map. Specific. Navigable. She could close her eyes and feel the precise location of every damaged or broken bond within the kingdom's packed territory, the way you feel the layout of a room you have lived in for years. Without needing light, without needing to think about it, she knew the distance, the direction, the specific quality of each break, whether it was the long-stretched damage of forced separation, the sharp, clean wound of a recent severance, the slow calcification of a bond that had been straining without support for years until it had gone rigid and cold and nearly unreachable. 189 damaged bonds. 43 complete breaks. 11 bonds so damaged that she could feel, even from this distance, that the people carrying them were in genuine physical decline, because this was something the kingdom's official medical system had never adequately documented. That severe bond damage produced physical symptoms. That people died of it quietly and were assigned other causes of death because no one had the language or the will to write bond grief on an official record. She sat up carefully. Her hands were steady. Her body was tired in the deep way of something that had been through an enormous amount and was now simply present with the aftermath, neither dramatic nor collapsed, simply there. She thought about the assembly hall, about the cold stone floor, about the specific and terrible clarity of hearing him continue to read while she lay in the weight of the kingdom's collected suffering. She did not linger on this. She had decided somewhere in the 3 days of unconsciousness, going to linger on it. There was too much else to do, and lingering required energy. She did not intend to spend that way. She picked up the cup of water and drank it. On the table beside the cup was a small folded note. She opened it. It was from the border holding administrator, a woman named Pels, whose handwriting was careful and whose message was brief. You may stay as long as you need. There is food in the outer room. I have told no one you are here. Emmara read this twice. Then she folded it and set it down and sat for a moment with the unexpected weight of a small kindness, which was sometimes, she had found, harder to receive than difficulty. She thought about what she knew, about the map of the kingdom's hidden suffering now living permanently in her awareness, about the 11 people in genuine physical decline, about the one who registered most urgently, a bonded pair in the village of Sethrin, 2 hours south, whose bond had been in the final stage of calcification for 6 weeks, and who had perhaps another 3 weeks before the damage became irreversible. She thought about what her mother had written in the last of her letters. The gift will expand when it is ready, not when you are. When it does, you will know more than you can carry alone. The question is not whether to use it. The question is where to begin. She stood, found her satchel against the wall, her traveling clothes folded beside it. Pels again, she thought, careful and quiet. She dressed methodically and braided her hair and looked at the gray wall for exactly 1 breath. She knew where to begin. She picked up her satchel and walked toward the door. And the map of the kingdom's suffering moved with her, settled into her awareness like a compass that does not point north but points always toward the nearest wound. Outside, the morning was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to what had happened in the assembly hall 3 days ago, which she found unexpectedly something close to a relief. The village of Sethrin sat in a shallow valley between 2 limestone ridges, the kind of place that had been settled because the ridges broke the wind rather than because the land was particularly generous. It had a market square, a cooperative well, 40 households, and a particular quality of collective sadness that Emmara could feel from the road above the valley before she had descended far enough to see the first rooftop. She had felt collective sadness before. Her gift had always made her sensitive to the emotional weather of any community she entered. The way some people are sensitive to changes in atmospheric pressure. This was different. This was specific. She could feel the source of it the way you can feel the location of a fire by the direction heat comes from even in a darkened room. The bonded pair her map had flagged were named Orin and Sessa. She knew their names from the map. This was one of the things she was still adjusting to. The specificity of what the expansion had given her. It was not simply locations and pain signatures. It was names sometimes, faces occasionally, the particular texture of a bond's history, the accumulated weight of the years that had made it what it currently was. Orin and Sessa had been bonded for 11 years. They had been forcibly relocated to separate administrative districts 4 years ago under a resettlement order that neither of them had been consulted about. And the bond between them had been stretching across the distance ever since, month by month, losing its elasticity, becoming first tight and then rigid, and then over the past 6 weeks. Something that was no longer stretching, but simply set, fixed in a position of strain. Like a healed fracture that has healed incorrectly and must be rebroken before it can be set right. She found Orin first, in the cooperative yard behind the market square, doing the mechanical work of someone whose hands have learned to function without the full participation of the rest of them. He was perhaps 40 years old and looked older, with the particular hollowed quality around the eyes that she had come to recognize as the face of long-term bond damage. Not grief exactly, more like a sustained diminishment, as though some essential source of replenishment had been interrupted for so long that the system had begun, very slowly, to run down. She introduced herself simply, with her given name only. She did not say what she was or what she intended. She asked if he would sit with her for a while. He looked at her with the mild incuriosity of someone too tired to wonder about much. He sat. The mending process began, as it always did, with stillness. She settled herself across from him in the cooperative yard with her hands in her lap and went to the quiet place. Not the same quiet place as her gift's full expansion, but the preliminary space, the anteroom of her deeper awareness, where she could extend her bond sense toward a specific damaged bond without opening to everything simultaneously. She found Orin's bond immediately. It registered like a taut wire, vibrating at a frequency just below comfortable, running southwest in the direction of wherever Sessa was, and carrying the particular signal of something that had been asking a question for 4 years without receiving an answer. She reached toward the calcified damage, carefully, the way you approach something brittle, not gripping, simply contact. She felt the pain of it as her gift made contact, felt it transfer partially into her own awareness in the necessary exchange of the mending process. And she held it there, present and acknowledged, and began the slow work of moving it. Not removing it. She could not remove bond pain. No one could. It was real and it had happened, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of damage. But moving it through the system rather than letting it sit calcified. Redirecting the rigidity into something that could flow again, however slowly. It took 4 hours with Oren alone. When she finished and released the transferred pain, a private process, done behind the cooperative hall, while Oren sat in the yard with the slowly dawning expression of someone whose chronic headache has begun to ease. She was shaking and hungry and needed 20 minutes before she could trust her legs to carry her to find Sessa. Sessa was in the Eastern Household District, and the second half of the mending took 3 more hours. And by the time Emmara walked out of the village, as the sun was going low and orange over the western ridge, she was operating on the last of her available resources with the focused economy of someone who has learned exactly how far she can push and has decided that today the answer is this far and no further. She sat on the hillside above the valley and released the remainder of what she had absorbed from both of them. It moved through her and out, the way absorbed pain always did when she released it properly, not vanishing but dispersing, losing its concentrated form, spreading into the general atmosphere of the world where it became simply part of the background weight that everyone carried without knowing it. She became aware, gradually, that she was not alone. An old woman was sitting on a flat rock 15 feet away, watching her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have seen unusual things before and have learned to observe them without panic. She was perhaps 70. With the weathered self-possession of someone who has spent decades in a place where the ridges break the wind, and the land is not particularly generous, and you develop a certain durability simply by continuing. Her name, Emmara knew from the map, was Corin. She was unbonded, had been for 30 years. Since her mate died, and she carried that old loss with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who has integrated something enormous into their daily existence and no longer trips over it, but has simply made room for it permanently. She said, "You are a bond healer." It was not a question. Emmara looked at her. "Yes," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud without qualification or apology or the automatic flinching that the court had trained into her. It felt, in her mouth, like the correct name for something that had always been true. Corin nodded once, as though a minor administrative matter had been resolved. Then she said, "There are 14 more damaged pairs within a day's walk of this valley. I know 4 of them personally. I have been watching them get worse for years." She paused. "I did not know there was such a thing as a bond healer. I did not know anyone was coming." Emmara looked at the orange light on the ridge. She thought about her map, the 189 damaged bonds, the 43 complete breaks, the 11 people in physical decline. She thought about how long it had been accumulating without anyone coming. "I am here now," she said. Corin looked at her for a long moment with the assessing thoroughness of a woman who has lived long. Enough to know the difference between a person who says something and a person who means it. "Yes," Corin said finally. "I can see that you are." Her mother's letters were tied with a piece of blue cord. There were 11 of them, written over the course of the 7 years between Emmara's presentation at court and her mother's death. And they lived at the bottom of her satchel in a waterproof wrap that she had sewn herself because they were the things she would save first from any disaster, and she had wanted them protected before the disaster arrived. She had read them so many times that she knew their contents precisely, could have recited any passage from memory, and still needed to read them in her mother's handwriting to feel their full weight. The way some truths require their original form to remain completely true. She read them on her second night in exile, sitting beside a small fire outside Sethrin with Corin's valley below her and the map of the kingdoms suffering quietly present in her awareness like a second heartbeat she had not asked for and could not silence. Her mother's name had been Ren. She had possessed what she called a partial version of the gift, enough bond sense to feel the health of bonds in her immediate vicinity, enough to sometimes sense the emotional quality of damage without being able to specify its source or location. She had recognized what Emmara was from the time Emmara was 4 years old, which was the year Emmara had sat down in the middle of the village market square and begun to cry with the focused devastation of a child receiving information she had no framework to process. Because 2 households away a bonded pair was in the middle of a severe rupture, and the pain of it had simply arrived in Emmara's small body without warning or filter. Ren had known then. She had picked Emmara up from the market square and carried her home and explained, with the careful patience of someone who had been preparing this explanation for 4 years and was still not entirely sure it was adequate. That some people felt things that were happening to others, that this was not madness and not weakness. That it was a gift even when it felt like the opposite of one. She had taught Emmara the basic practices, the quiet place, the preliminary filtering, the preliminary distance management that prevented the gift from overwhelming her in ordinary circumstances. She had not been able to teach her the advanced practices because she did not know them herself. Her version of the gift had never required them. The letters were, among other things, a sustained apology for this. The fourth letter, written when Emmara had been at court for 2 years, said, "I am hearing things from the capital that concern me, not about your position or your standing. I know you are managing those things with more grace than I would have. I am concerned about the collapses. 3 and 6 months is not the gift simply being itself. That is the gift trying to expand beyond its current management and finding no room. You need someone who knows the advanced practices. I do not know who that person is. I am looking. Please do not push through the collapses without support. They are not weakness. They are the gift asking for what it needs." Emmara had not found anyone who knew the advanced practices. She had pushed through the collapses. She had managed them with increasing skill and increasing cost, had learned to predict them by the specific quality of the pressure that preceded them, had learned to find private spaces when she felt them coming so that the court would not see them. When the court saw them anyway, because the gift was not always predictable. Because a severe rupture in the vicinity could trigger a collapse without warning. She had watched her position erode collapse by collapse, had watched the advisor's reports pile up, had watched Aldrich receive them with the expression of a man receiving information he did not know how to evaluate, and was therefore evaluating by its social cost rather than its content. She had not told him what she was. Not fully. Not with the directness that the situation had required. Because the court had trained directness out of her the way it trained everything inconvenient out of people. By making the cost of it too high too often until avoidance became habitual. This was her own failure, and she was honest enough to name it as such. Sitting beside her fire on the second night of exile. She had been afraid, and she had been indirect, and she had hoped that proximity would eventually generate understanding without requiring her to risk the clarity of a direct explanation. It had not worked. Proximity without honesty generated familiarity, which was not the same thing at all. She knew, through the bond's ragged edge, that he was awake. She had been aware of this since the breaking, could feel the specific quality of his wakefulness through what remained of the bond. The particular texture of a man who is not sleeping because he is thinking rather than because he is in distress, though the distinction was perhaps finer than he would have liked. She also knew something that she had not yet decided what to do with. The bond had not broken cleanly. This was not sentiment or wishful perception. It was a clinical observation, as precise as anything else her gift produced. A bond severed by declaration alone, without the metaphysical completion that a true severance required, did not break cleanly. It tore, and a torn bond left a ragged edge on both sides, present, transmitting, alive in the diminished and damaged way of something that has been cut, but not separated. He could feel it too. She knew this with certainty. The question was whether he would admit it, and to whom, and when. She put her mother's letters away in their waterproof wrap and tied the blue cord carefully and set them back in the bottom of her satchel. Then her gift map pulsed. Not with the general background awareness she had been navigating for 2 days, but with something specific and urgent, a sharp directional signal from the north for days' walk. Registering with the particular quality she had begun to learn meant physical decline rather than simply emotional damage. A single person, an elder from the Northern Territory, unbonded, carrying the unresolved grief of a bond that had been lost 40 years ago and had never been properly closed. The bond had been transmitting into empty space for 4 decades with no one to receive it and no one to help her close it. And the accumulated cost of that sustained transmission was visible in her signal the way advanced illness is visible in a person's walk. She was running out of time. Emmara laced her boots and banked her fire and checked the contents of her satchel with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to move when the map says move. She was already walking north before dawn. 6 weeks after the exile, The council chamber in the capital smelled of cold candle wax and managed anxiety. Aldrich sat at the head of the long table and listened to his advisors present the bond breakdown reports with the particular quality of attention he had developed over the past 6 weeks. Surface focus, correct responses at correct intervals. The performed competence of a king who is visibly present and internally somewhere else entirely. The reports came from 7 territories. The language was administrative and precise and described in the dry vocabulary of governance. Something that was not dry at all: families fracturing, communities losing their cohesion. The invisible architecture of pact bonds that held social structures together developing cracks at an accelerating rate. His head advisor, a man named Corvith whose political instincts were excellent and whose understanding of people was correspondingly poor, presented the summary with the confident fluency of someone who has predecided the conclusion and is working backward through the evidence. The bond breakdown acceleration was, Corvith argued, a convergence of pre-existing stressors, the resettlement policy's implementation, seasonal economic pressures, the natural cycle of bond attrition that occurred in any large population. Unfortunate timing. No single cause. Certainly no connection to recent administrative decisions at the court level. Aldrich let him finish. Then he looked at the numbers. 7 territories. 43% acceleration in documented bond breakdown reports in 6 weeks. The previous 6-week period before the assembly had shown a 12% acceleration. The period before that, 8%. The assembly had been 6 weeks ago. He knew what Corvith was not saying. He knew because the bond's ragged edge in his chest told him, every morning before he was fully awake, pulling in a direction that his body had not yet learned to stop following. He had reached for her through it twice in the first week, involuntarily, the way you reach for something in the dark that has always been there. Both times he had caught himself and pulled back and spent the rest of the day with the specific, self-directed anger of a man who has done something he cannot undo and keeps being reminded of it by his own nervous system. He did not reach for her anymore. He had gotten very good, over 6 weeks, at not reaching. What he had not gotten good at was sleeping, or eating with any particular interest, or walking through the assembly hall without his stride changing slightly at the point where the center floor met the 4 witnessing pillars. The specific geometry of what he had done marking itself on his body, the way significant events mark themselves, without asking permission. Outside the council chamber, far to the south, something entirely different was happening. 11 bonds mended across 3 territories in 6 weeks, each one quiet and unrecorded. Known only to the pairs who had been healed, and to the few witnesses like Corin, who had followed Emmara from village to village with a steadily expanding understanding of what they were watching. The people she had mended did not announce it. They had no official vocabulary for what had happened to them, and the official systems had no category for it. And so the healing existed in the register of the known but unnamed, spreading through communities as story rather than report. The stories were reaching the capital, not through official channels, through the other channels, the ones that had always moved faster and carried more truth, the traders and the couriers and the border administrators, and the quiet accumulation of word from person to person that constituted the kingdom's actual information system beneath its official one. Aldrich had heard 3 of these stories in the past 2 weeks. He had not mentioned them in council. He had sat with them privately, in the pre-dawn hours when the bond's ragged edge was most insistent, and had felt something he had no adequate name for, not pride exactly, not relief, something more complicated than either. Something that required him to sit very still and not examine it too directly. Corvith finished his presentation. The council waited for Aldrich's response. He gave them a list of action items, a territorial review commission, an accelerated report from the Eastern Province administrators, a meeting with the medical corps regarding the physical health correlations in the breakdown data, correct responses, sufficient responses. Then the door of the council chamber opened. The chamber steward entered with the particular expression of someone interrupting a meeting who has decided that the interruption is warranted and is prepared to defend this decision. He carried a single folded message bearing the seal of Elder Mavn of the Northern Territories, the oldest active elder in the kingdom, whose seal on a message meant the message would be read immediately by anyone with the political intelligence to understand what it meant when Mavin chose to write rather than simply arrive. Aldrich read it. It was 4 sentences. The first 3 documented the bond breakdown crisis in clinical terms more precise than anything his advisory council had produced. The 4th sentence said, "I am calling an emergency elder session in 7 days at the Capitol. Attendance is not optional. I have one agenda item." Corvith, reading over his shoulder with the automatic presumption of a man who had been doing so for years, made a small sound of professional concern. Aldrich set the message down on the table with the careful placement of someone putting something in a position where it cannot be ignored. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the Capitol moved through its morning with the ordinary purposefulness of a city that did not yet know it was about to hear something that would require it to reconsider several things it had considered settled. Elder Mavin arrived at the Capitol on the 6th day, 1 day early, which everyone who knew her had expected. She was 93 years old and moved through the world with the specific, unhurried authority of someone who has long since stopped performing urgency because they have learned that genuine urgency requires stillness rather than speed. She was small and dark-eyed and wore the Northern Territory's traditional elder gray without ceremony. And she had been assessing the health of pack bonds across the kingdom for 7 decades with a precision that the official medical corps had never matched and had occasionally resented. She did not stay in the formal guest quarters prepared for her. She stayed with a retired border administrator named Hess who lived in the Eastern District and who had, decades ago, been her student. She arrived at the council hall on the morning of the 7th day carrying nothing but a leather document folder that was very full and a cup of tea that she had made herself in Hess's kitchen and intended to finish regardless of what the agenda required. The council hall held 30 people for the emergency session, every elder who had been able to reach the Capitol in 7 days. 3 senior territorial administrators, Aldrich's full advisory council, and Aldrich himself, who had not slept adequately in 6 weeks, and whose composure was holding with the practiced solidity of a man who has been trained since childhood to present a surface that does not reflect the interior. Mavin sat down, set her tea on the table, opened her document folder, and began without preamble. She did not say good morning. She did not acknowledge the formalities of session opening. She looked at the room with the dark and comprehensive gaze of someone who has decided that the situation does not have time for its own social architecture, and began speaking in the level, unhurried tone of a woman delivering findings she has been compiling for considerably longer than 7 days. She had been tracking the bond breakdown rate for 4 years. Not 6 weeks. For years. The acceleration had been gradual enough in its early stages to fall beneath the threshold of official reporting. And Mavin had watched it with the patient attention of someone who knows that patterns reveal themselves to whoever is willing to wait long enough for the data to accumulate. She had documented 312 bond breakdown incidents across 11 territories over those 4 years, with dates, locations, and the specific administrative contexts in which each breakdown had occurred or accelerated. She presented this documentation now, reading selected entries with the deliberate pacing of a person who understands that the weight of evidence is felt most fully when it is not rushed. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they are receiving something that requires the reorganization of prior understanding. Then she addressed the past 6 weeks directly. The 43% acceleration following the assembly, she said, was not a coincidence and was not a convergence of pre-existing stressors. It was a documented phenomenon with a specific cause and a documented precedent. When a figure of institutional authority publicly dissolves a bond in a formally witnessed setting, the signal transmitted to the pack is that bonds are politically disposable. This signal, absorbed at the instinctive level by every bonded individual within pack range, produces a measurable increase in voluntary bond dissolution and an equally measurable increase in bond damage from the psychological stress of insecurity. She cited 2 historical precedents, read the relevant passages, set the documents on the table. Corvith began to speak. Mavin looked at him. He stopped. She spoke for another 20 minutes about bond sense. She used the old term without apology or explanation of its unfamiliarity, as though the room's ignorance of the term was the room's problem and not hers. She described what it was, how it manifested, what it could do. And what the kingdom was losing every day it continued, without a practitioner of the gift working in any official or supported capacity. She described the historical record, the last documented bond-sense practitioner, 2 centuries ago, who had managed a kingdom-wide bond crisis of comparable severity, and whose methods had been recorded in the Northern Archive in texts that Mavin had read, and that the capital's official medical corps had apparently never opened. She was specific about this. She named the archive, the shelf, the text. She looked at the medical corps representative as she did so, with an expression that communicated precisely what she thought of texts going unread on accessible shelves. Then she closed her folder. She picked up her tea, looked at the room. She said, "The kingdom has a bond-sense practitioner. She is currently working in exile in the Southern Territories, without support, without resources, without official recognition, mending bonds that your administrative policies broke, at personal cost to herself that no one has thought to ask about." Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. She has mended 14 bonds in 6 weeks. She is one person working alone. The breakdown rate is accelerating faster than one person can address. She said, "The solution is not complicated. The solution has one step." She looked at Aldrich. She said, "You will go find her yourself. Not a courier, not a delegation, not a formal reinstatement letter sealed with the crown mark and delivered by someone who was not present in the assembly hall and does not carry the specific accountability that presence requires. You, alone, on the road, without the architecture of your office between you and what you did." The room was completely silent. Mavin finished her tea. He left before dawn on the second day after the elder session. No formal departure, no ceremonial send-off, no advisory council assembled in the courtyard to provide last-minute counsel that was really last-minute resistance dressed in the vocabulary of concern. He had told Corvith the evening before, in the specific tone that ended conversations rather than opening them, that he was riding south on personal business, and that the council would manage the kingdom's daily operations under the existing protocols until his return. Corvith had opened his mouth. Aldrich had looked at him. Corvith had closed it again. He took one horse, his own, and a pack with 4 days of supplies. And he rode out of the capital in the pre-dawn dark with the particular sensation of a man who has been sitting in a burning building for 6 weeks telling himself the smoke was manageable and has finally, simply, stood up and walked toward the door. The road south gave him 4 days of his own company, which turned out to be the most honest company he had kept in years. He had not, in the 6 weeks since the assembly, allowed himself to think about it directly. He had managed it the way he managed most things that were too large for immediate processing, by keeping it in the peripheral vision of his attention, acknowledging its presence without turning to face it, maintaining forward motion as a substitute for reckoning. 4 days on a southern road with nothing requiring his attention and no one requiring his performance removed this option entirely. There was nothing to do but ride and think and arrive, by slow and uncomfortable degrees, at the unmediated truth of what he had done. He had practiced the dissolution declaration. This was the fact he kept returning to, the one that resisted the various framings he had tried to place around it. He had stood in his study and read the 3 pages aloud alone, adjusting his cadence until it carried the quality of measured authority he had wanted the court to hear. He had practiced it the way he practiced formal addresses, with the professional attention of someone who understood that delivery shaped reception, that how a thing was said determined how it was understood. He had known while practicing that she would be in the hall. He had known while practicing that she would hear every word. He had practiced it anyway. This was not a complicated fact. It did not require sophisticated analysis or the mitigating context his advisors had been quietly providing for 6 weeks. It was simply what he had done, stated plainly. And the plainness of it was something he had been avoiding with considerable energy, and was now, on the 3rd day of a southern road with the bond's ragged edge in his chest and the autumn trees going bare around him, no longer able to avoid. He thought about the collapses, the 6 episodes he had witnessed over the course of their bond, each one framed by his advisors in the language of instability and liability and public perception. He had accepted that framing without investigation, which was its own specific failure, a man of his training and his position, accepting a single interpretation of evidence without asking for alternatives, without asking her for her own account of what the collapses were and what caused them. He had the resources to investigate. He had the standing to ask. He had done neither, because asking would have required him to prioritize understanding over convenience. And he had been very busy, and the advisors had made it very easy not to ask. He arrived in the southern border territory on the afternoon of the 4th day, and stopped at the first village he reached, a small settlement called Brenhill. 2 hours north of the valley Corin had described to the trader, who had described it to the border administrator, who had described it to the capital's information network, which Aldrich had been quietly monitoring for 2 weeks. He asked at the village well where the healer woman was working today. The woman drawing water looked at him with the assessing directness of a southern border villager, who has learned that people arriving from the north asking questions deserve a moment of evaluation before receiving answers. She evaluated him. He sat still for it, which was apparently the correct response, because she told him. 3rd Valley East, the Marin Farm. She has been there since morning. He found the farm as the afternoon light was going long and amber across the valley fields. He came over the ridge and saw the farmyard below and stopped his horse at the gate. She was there. She was seated on a low stool between 2 people he did not know, a man and a woman of middle age, who were both sitting very still with the particular quality of people in the presence of something they do not entirely understand, but have decided to trust. Emmara's hands were in her lap, not touching either of them. Her whole body was angled toward the pair with an intensity of attention that was the most focused thing he had ever seen, focused the way a flame is focused, entirely committed to its single direction, consuming itself in the service of its light. He did not call out. He did not open the gate. He watched. He watched for a long time as the afternoon light moved and the farmyard was quiet, and she worked at something he could not see and could not name and had never, in all the time he had known her, thought to ask about. She finished. She stood slowly, with the careful movement of someone managing exhaustion and not wanting it to be visible. She turned toward the gate. She looked directly at him. She did not look surprised. She met him at the gate as the last amber light left the valley. She did not open it. She stood on her side of it with her satchel over her shoulder and her hands loose at her sides and looked at him across the worn wood with the expression he had been seeing in his mind for 6 weeks, not the expression from the assembly hall floor, not the collapse, but the expression from the last ordinary morning before everything. When she had looked at him across the breakfast table with something in her eyes, he had not known how to read, and had therefore not tried to. He understood it now. It had been the expression of someone deciding whether to say a thing that needed to be said and concluding, for the 100th time, that the cost was too high. He understood it because he had spent 4 days on a southern road understanding things he had previously declined to understand. And the understanding sat in him now like ballast, heavy, stabilizing, entirely without comfort. He dismounted, stood at his side of the gate. The horse moved to investigate the fence post and lost interest and stood quietly. He said her name. She said, "You look like you have not slept." "I have not slept adequately in 6 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. And then, before he could process the specific weight of those 2 words, "Corin told me you were on the southern road 2 days ago. A trader from Brenhill." She looked at him steadily. "I have known you were coming since yesterday morning." He absorbed this. "Did you consider leaving before I arrived?" She considered the question with the honest attention she gave everything. "Yes," she said, "for approximately 10 minutes. Then I had work to do, and the 10 minutes ended." He looked at the gate between them. He had a great deal to say, and had organized none of it, which was not his usual condition before a significant conversation, and which he recognized as meaningful. He had not organized it, because organizing it would have meant choosing a framing. And he had decided, somewhere on the southern road, that framing was exactly what had gotten him here, and was not something he was willing to bring to this gate. He said, "I came to ask you to return to the capital." "I know why you came," she said. Her voice was level and without hostility, which was almost harder to receive than anger would have been. Elder Mavin session. The bond breakdown rate. 7 territories. She paused. The kingdom needs what I can do. I am aware. That is not the only reason I came, he said. She looked at him. The bond's ragged edge pulsed between them in the cooling evening air. Present and insistent and entirely without subtlety. I know that too, she said quietly. He stepped closer to the gate, not reaching for the latch, simply closer. The way you move toward a conversation that requires proximity, to be honest. I want to explain. You practiced it, she said. He stopped. 3 pages, she said. You read it aloud in your study at least twice. I felt the moment you settled on the cadence. She was not accusing. She was simply stating, in the precise and unembellished register of her gift, what she had experienced. I felt the decision before you made it formal. I felt the weeks of it building. A pause. I did not tell you that I knew because I was afraid that knowing I knew would make you feel surveilled rather than understood. And I was still, at that point, trying to be careful of your comfort. She looked at him with the clear and slightly weary expression of someone who has identified one of their own patterns and is not pleased with it. That was a mistake. I should have said it directly. I was not direct enough for a long time about what I was and what I knew. He was quiet for a moment. This was not the conversation he had prepared for. Which was the point. She had moved them past the prepared version and into the true one with 2 sentences, which was, he was realizing, entirely characteristic of a woman he had spent years not fully listening to. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. The bond, he said. The ragged edge. I feel it every morning before I am awake enough to manage it. He held her gaze. Do you feel it? The valley was very quiet around them. A bird called once from the ridge and was answered and went silent. Yes, she said. Then you know it did not break cleanly. I have known that since the assembly hall floor, she said. He looked at her across the gate in the last of the evening light and said, I am not asking you to return for the kingdom. I am asking for the chance to do this differently. I do not know yet what differently looks like. I know what it is not. He paused. It is not 30 seconds and a memorized declaration. She studied him for a long moment. The assessment was thorough and unhurried, and he stayed present for all of it. Then she said, I am not finished here. There are 14 bonds remaining in this territory alone. She unlatched the gate and stepped through it to his side. But I did not tell you to leave. The village of Severance's eastern cluster had 4 damaged bonds in close proximity. Emmara had known this since the morning after her first mending. Her gift map had flagged the cluster with the particular quality of signal that indicated interconnection. Bonds that had been damaged in relation to each other rather than independently. Their pain signatures overlapping in the way of things that share a common cause. She had been saving the cluster for when she had enough resources to address all 4 in sequence. Because working on interconnected bonds required a specific continuity, breaking off in the middle of a cluster mending could leave the partially treated bonds in a more destabilized state than before, like opening a wound and not finishing the suturing. She had enough resources now. She also, for the first time, had someone who could manage the practical architecture of a long day's work so that she did not have to. She did not explain this to Aldrich in those terms. She simply told him, on the morning after the gate, that she was going to Severance's eastern cluster and that if he intended to follow her he should bring food for 2 and expect to spend the day doing whatever she asked without requiring explanations for each request. He said, all right. She looked at him. He met the look with the specific quality of attention that she had been noticing since his arrival, a quality she did not yet entirely trust but was beginning to catalog. The way you catalog evidence before drawing conclusions. He was listening differently than he had before. She did not know yet whether this was situational or fundamental. She was watching for the difference. They walked to Severance's eastern cluster in the early morning cold, and she went in while he stayed at the perimeter of the first household's outer yard in the position she indicated without comment. The first mending took 2 hours. The second took 2.5. By the end of the second, she had absorbed enough transferred pain that the world had the slightly overbright quality it always acquired when she was carrying more than her usual load, colors a degree too vivid, sounds a register too present. The particular heightened sensitivity of a system that has opened itself wider than comfortable and is managing the excess with conscious effort. She came out of the second household, and Aldrich was there with food. Not handed to her with ceremony or comment. Simply placed in her hands the way you hand someone something they need, practically, and without making it significant. She ate standing, looking at the Eastern Cluster's third household, organizing what she knew about the third bond before going in. He asked no questions. He watched, from the perimeter distances she indicated, with the focused and non-invasive attention of someone who understands that witnessing requires silence. The third mending was the most complex, a bond that had been damaged by a grief event, the death of a child, and had been fracturing along the specific fault line that grief opened in bonds that had not been built with enough deliberate repair work before the loss arrived. She spent 3 hours with this one, moving through layers of damage in sequence, each layer requiring its own careful engagement before the next could be approached. When she came out, her hands were shaking, and she sat down on the yard step without deciding to and put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She heard him sit down beside her. Not close, the distance they always maintained, the careful and mutually understood gap that acknowledged everything between them without requiring it to be named, but present, steady in the specific way she had been noticing since his arrival, the steadiness of a man who has stopped performing stillness and is simply being still, which were different qualities, and she could feel the difference through the bond's ragged edge. She ate the food he had ready without opening her eyes. She felt the shaking in her hands ease by degrees as the afternoon passed. She said, without looking at him, "The fourth one will take until dark." "I will be here," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at the fourth household across the yard. The third bond, the grief fracture. The damage pattern, there is the most common kind I find in the cluster sites. Not dramatic, not sudden. A bond that was not tended during a hard season until the untending became structural. She paused. Most of what I am finding in exile could have been prevented. Not by any extraordinary intervention. Simply by someone noticing earlier and helping sooner. He was quiet for a moment. Someone like you. Someone like me, or someone trained in what I know. Or simply someone with a framework that recognized bond damage as a thing worth addressing. She stood, steadied herself. Instead, the knowledge was exiled. She said it without looking at him. She said it as an observation, not an accusation. She had learned the difference, had been practicing it. Finding that observations reached people in ways that accusations could not, because accusations activated defenses while observations simply sat in the room and waited to be looked at. She felt him receive it, through the bond's ragged edge. She felt the specific quality of a man sitting with something true, without trying to move it away from himself. She went into the fourth household. 8 hours later, she came out. The Eastern Cluster was silent behind her, the particular silence of 4 households that had been carrying a sustained and grinding noise in their foundations for years and had, in the last 12 hours, felt that noise begin to quiet. She stood in the yard in the dark and breathed, and let the last of the absorbed pain disperse. Through and out of her with the slow patience the process required. Aldrich was at the yard's edge with the last of the food and a small fire he had built at the perimeter, practical and warm and asking nothing. She sat beside it. He sat across from it. The fire burned between them, and the bond hummed its ragged and persistent hum, and the night was very quiet. Then her gift map pulsed with the enormous complex signal she had been aware was building for 2 days. Coming from the north,
here.
multiple sources, overlapping and urgent. Not a single pair. Not a cluster. Something larger. She looked up.
Thank
He was
you.
already looking at her. They left for the north before sunrise.
The gold
Emmara had
sits
told Corin the
heavy.
previous evening, in the
It
brief
should.
practical exchange that had become their standard mode of
Does
communication,
it change anything?
that she was going to Dremholt and would be
Not
back in
for
10
the
days,
working
or would send
man.
word if it was longer. Corin had looked at the king standing at a respectful distance behind Emmara's left shoulder and then back at Emmara with the specific expression of a woman who has lived 70 years and has developed a comprehensive understanding of complicated situations and has decided that commentary is unnecessary when observation is sufficient. She had handed Emmara a wrapped parcel of food and gone back inside. The northern road was 3 days. 3 days of hoarse and cold air, and the kind of enforced proximity that travel creates between people who are navigating something unresolved. The shared meals at roadside stops. The small logistical exchanges that accumulate into a texture of interaction. The particular intimacy of riding the same road in the same direction for long enough that the effort of maintaining distance becomes more exhausting than simply being present. She had decided, somewhere in the first day, to let herself be present. Not to decide anything larger than that. Not to answer the questions that the bond's persistent hum was asking in its ragged and inarticulate way. Simply to be present with the fact of him riding beside her on a northern road. Having come alone, and without ceremony because an elder told him to, and because something in him had apparently decided that the elder was right. She watched him, from the peripheral attention she had always been able to deploy without appearing to deploy it. He was different on a road than he had been in the court. The court version of him had always carried a specific kind of density, the compression of someone who is constantly managing what they project, editing in real time, maintaining a surface calibrated to the political requirements of each moment. The road version was less compressed. Not unguarded exactly, but with more of his actual interior visible. The way a building looks different when you remove the ornamental facade and see the working architecture beneath. On the afternoon of the second day, he asked about her mother. Not as a political maneuver, not as a conversational strategy deployed to create the impression of interest. She had felt enough versions of performed interest in the court to know its texture, and this was not that. He asked with the simple directness of someone who has realized they do not know something they should know and has decided that the most straightforward path to knowing it is to ask. She told him about Ren, about the market square at 4 years old, about the partial gift and the letters and the careful patient teaching of a woman who knew the shape of what her daughter carried, but not its full dimension. She told him about the advanced practices that her mother had not been able to teach her and that she had never found anyone else to teach. About the collapses that had been the gift attempting to expand without adequate support and finding none. She told him what the expansion had felt like in the assembly hall. Not the pain of the breaking, which she had told him about at the gate, but the specific quality of receiving 1,000 pain signatures simultaneously, each one distinct and located, the overwhelming particularity of it, the fact that what had filled her in that moment was not chaos but information, devastating and organized and entirely without mercy. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she thought he was organizing a response, the court habit of composing before speaking. Then he said, without looking away from the road ahead, "I watched you collapse 3 times. My advisors told me it was instability. I accepted that framing without asking you what it was." "Yes," she said. "I did not ask because asking would have required me to be prepared for an answer that complicated what I had already decided to do." He paused. "That is not a mitigation. It is an explanation of the specific failure." She looked at the road ahead. "I know. I also know that I did not make it easy to ask. I was not direct about what the collapses were because I was afraid that directness would cost more than silence." She paused. We were both managing the situation rather than addressing it. "Yes," he said. And then, after a moment, "I practiced the dissolution declaration." "I know. I want you to know that I know what that means. That I am not going to frame it as anything other than what it was." He looked at her then, directly, with the quality of attention that she had begun, carefully and against her better instincts, to find steadying. "I decided to hurt you in the most public way available, and I executed that decision with preparation and care. That is the accurate description." The road curved north around a limestone outcrop, and the wind changed direction, and for a moment the cold had a different quality, carrying the particular clean sharpness of the northern territories approaching. She said, "I also felt the moment you regretted it." He went still. "Not after," she said. "During. While you were still reading. There was a moment, the second page, I think, though I was not entirely present, when something in the bond's transmission changed quality. Not the declaration. Something beneath it." She looked at him. "I felt it." The road was very quiet around them. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, stripped of the last layer of management, simply itself. "It was when you fell," he said. "The sound of it." She absorbed this, filed it in the careful and honest part of herself that was building an account of who he was beneath who he had been. Then her gift map pulsed, the northern signal intensifying, closer now. Multiple bond signatures overlapping with the urgent complexity of a situation that had been deteriorating for longer than anyone had reported. Dremholt was one day ahead. Whatever was waiting for them there was large, and it was getting larger, and it required everything she had. She urged her horse forward on the northern road, and he matched her pace without being asked. And they rode toward the crisis together in the cold northern air with the bond humming its ragged and persistent question between them, unanswered and alive. Dremholt had the particular quality of a community that has been in collective pain for long enough that the pain has become architectural. It was visible in the way people moved through the village streets, not with the purposeful flow of a healthy community but with the careful, slightly avoidant quality of individuals who have learned to navigate around each other's wounds, who have developed the social habits of people living in close proximity to a sustained emergency that no one has officially named. The market stalls were understocked. The cooperative hall was locked. 3 households on the main road had the specific closed quality of dwellings whose inhabitants had stopped going out more than necessity required. Emmara felt the 37 damaged bonds before she reached the village perimeter. They arrived in her awareness as a dense and overlapping field of pain signatures, each one distinct, but all of them connected in the way her map had indicated from the south, a cascade rather than a cluster. Bonds that had been damaged in relation to each other, through a shared cause rather than independently. The shared cause was a resettlement order issued 8 months ago from the capital's administrative council, which had redrawn the territorial boundaries of the northern district and relocated 14 families across the new boundary lines with a 90-day implementation timeline and no impact assessment of any kind. The relocated families had been bonded across the boundary lines. The new administrative distance between them exceeded the sustainable range for bonds that had not been built for separation. The cascade had begun within weeks of the relocation. As the stretched bonds began to damage adjacent bonds through the pack's empathic network, bond pain, at sufficient intensity, transmitted to nearby bonded pairs and increased their own bond stress, which damaged their bonds, which transmitted to their neighbors, which was how a forced administrative decision affecting 14 families had produced 37 damaged bonds across an entire village community. She stood at the village perimeter for a long moment, feeling the full scope of it. Then she went to work. The first day was the most urgent cases, 4 bonds in the final stages before irreversible damage. The ones her map had flagged with the physical decline signal. She worked through them in sequence, spending between 2 and 4 hours with each pair. With Aldrich managing the practical architecture of the day in the way she had come to rely on without quite deciding to rely on it, ensuring she ate between sessions, keeping the curious and the concerned at a respectful distance from her working perimeter, communicating with the village elder about the process in the level, specific terms that the elder needed to organize appropriate support for the pairs being treated. He was good at this. She noted it with the honest attention she gave everything, not as a point in his favor in some ongoing accounting, but simply as a fact, the way you note that a tool is well suited to a task. The second day she worked 8 bonds, the third day 10. By the end of the third day, Aldrich had learned the practical rhythms of her work with a thoroughness that required no instruction. He anticipated what she needed before she identified it, positioned himself at the correct distance from each working space without being told, had organized a rota of village women, including Dremholt's midwife, to assist with the post-session care that the mended pairs required, rest and food, and the gentle human presence that helped the healing settle rather than reactivate. She was aware, in the brief intervals between sessions, that the bond between them was doing something. Not the ragged edge, that was a constant, familiar now managed. Something adjacent to it. A warmth that was not the bond's structural presence, but something generated by proximity and the specific quality of these days working together. The kind of warmth that accumulates between people who are operating in genuine coordination towards something that matters, who have been stripped of the social performances that ordinarily occupy the space between two people and have found, in the stripped space, something simpler and more durable. She did not examine it directly. She was too tired and too busy, and she had learned, from years of managing her gift, that some things required a particular kind of patient waiting rather than direct examination. That forcing premature clarity on a developing thing could damage it the way forcing premature closure on a healing bond could damage it. On the morning of the fourth day, a capital administrator arrived on horseback with 3 assistants and a document case. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the specific self-important efficiency of a mid-level official who has been given formal authority and is making the most of it. He introduced himself as Senior Administrator Preth, representing the Capital Administrative Council, and he produced a formal order bearing 3 council seals and Corvatha's signature. Emmara read the order without expression. It stated, in the precise and impersonal language of official prohibition, that Emmara Ashvale, pursuant to the terms of her exiled decree, was prohibited from practicing bond-related activities in any officially designated pact territory. Effective immediately, under penalty of formal criminal charge for violation of exile conditions. She folded the order, handed it to Aldrich, who was standing at her right shoulder. She turned back toward the village. Aldrich read the order. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases with the careful precision of someone performing a deliberate act, and he tore it in half. He tore each half in half again. He set the 4 pieces down on the road at Administrator Preth's feet with the specific quietness of someone who does not need volume to make a statement. Preth stared at him. Aldrich met his stare with the expression of a man who has made a decision and finds the aftermath of that decision entirely manageable. He said, "She is working. You will wait." She finished the last of Dremholt's 37 bonds on the evening of the 6th day. She sat afterward on the northern hillside above the village with her knees drawn up and her bandaged hands resting on them and her eyes closed. Not in the quiet place, but in the ordinary darkness behind closed eyes, which was its own kind of rest. Below her, Dremholt was doing something she had not heard it do in the 6 days since their arrival, generating the ambient sound of a community that has remembered how to be itself. Voices carrying across the evening air, a door opening and someone calling to a neighbor. The small and unremarkable music of people who have stopped navigating around each other's wounds and have begun simply moving through their days again. She had not yet released the absorbed pain from the final session. She was sitting with it deliberately, holding it present in her awareness rather than dispersing it immediately, because there was something in the quality of the last bond's damage that she wanted to examine before she let it go. A specificity in the pattern that she had been noticing since the 3rd day, but had been too occupied with the work itself to give full attention to. She turned her gift map on the kingdom's bond breakdown pattern. She had been working in it for weeks, moving through it pair by pair, address by address, the individual coordinates of individual suffering. She had not yet looked at it from a sufficient distance to see the shape of the whole. She did it now. The way you step back from a detailed painting to see its composition, widening her inner awareness from the specific to the general, letting the individual bond signatures become data points in a larger geography. The pattern revealed itself slowly, and then all at once. The way certain things become visible only when you are looking at the right scale. The cluster sites were not random. She had known they were not independently random. Each cluster had its own internal logic, its own cascade mechanism. What she had not seen until now was that the clusters themselves formed a pattern at the territorial level. A distribution that was not the distribution of natural bond stress in a large population. Natural bond stress was diffuse, arising from the ordinary pressures of individual lives across a broad geography. This was concentrated. The cluster sites mapped with near-perfect precision onto the territories that the resettlement policy had affected most intensively. The territories along the kingdom's internal administrative boundaries that had been redrawn over the past 4 years. The territories that were historically resistant to centralized political control, that had the strongest local pact bond networks, and therefore the strongest community resistance to external administrative authority. Strong pact bonds meant strong communities. Strong communities meant resistance. She sat with this observation for a very long time. Then she went further. She cross-referenced her map's timing data, the dates on which each cluster had begun its cascade, against the implementation timeline of the resettlement policy's successive phases. The correlation was not approximate. It was precise. Phase 1 of the resettlement policy had been implemented in the Eastern Territories 14 months ago. The Eastern Cluster sites showed the oldest bond damage in her map. Phase 2, the Northern Territories, 8 months ago. Dremholt's cascade began 9 months ago. Phase 3, the Southern Border Territories, 5 months ago. The Southern Clusters, including the first bonds she had mended in Seathran's Valley, had begun their damage patterns 5 to 6 months ago. One policy, for years of systematic implementation. Coordinated territorial disruption of pack bond networks in specifically selected communities. She opened her eyes. The northern hillside was very still in the evening dark. Below her, Dremholt's recovered sound continued its quiet music. She breathed through what she was feeling, not shock exactly. Because her gift had been showing her the evidence piece by piece for weeks, and some part of her had been building toward this conclusion without yet assembling it, but the specific and devastating clarity of a completed picture. The moment when all the fragments cohere, and you can no longer unsee the whole. She heard his boots on the hillside path. She had felt him through the bond as he climbed, the specific quality of his presence, which she had been learning to read with increasing precision over the past days. The particular texture of his attention moving in her direction. She let him reach her without turning around. He sat down beside her on the hillside. The distance between them was less than it had been at the farm gate, less than it had been for most of the days since. Not decided consciously, simply accumulated. The way distance accumulated from days of working beside each other toward the same thing. She said, "The resettlement policy." "Yes," he said. He was already in it. She could feel the quality of his attention already engaged. Already following the direction of her thought with the speed of someone who has been handling the kingdom's administrative intelligence for years and knows how to read a pattern when it is shown to him. For years, she said. Systematic. Specifically targeted at communities with the strongest local pack bond networks. The territories with the highest historical resistance to centralized administrative control. She paused. It was not a population management policy. It was a bond disruption policy. The resettlement was. The mechanism. The target was community cohesion. He was very still beside her. She continued. The timing of the acceleration I mapped tracks the policy's implementation phases exactly. Not approximately. Exactly. This is not a correlation. It is a documentation. She looked at him. Someone in the capital has been deliberately using administrative policy to fracture pack bonds in resistant territories for 4 years, while your advisory council presented the bond breakdown rate as a convergence of pre-existing stressors. His face moved through several things in the space of a few seconds. She watched the specific sequence, the pattern recognition arriving first, then the political implication, then the personal one. The one that was about who had been managing his advisory council's information, and what that management had been designed to prevent him from seeing. He said a name. She had not said it. She had been careful not to say it, had presented the evidence without the conclusion. Because she had learned in the tribunal hall 3 years ago that conclusions presented by the accused were treated as motivated reasoning, while conclusions arrived at independently carried a different weight entirely. He said the name quietly, almost to himself. Corvith. The same man who had filed the exile order petition. The same man who had campaigned for the public breaking. The same man whose signature had been on Administrator Pretha's prohibition order. The same man who had needed her gone before she could see what she was now seeing from a northern hillside with 6 weeks of exile and 147 documented bond disruptions. Organized in her awareness like evidence on a table. She said, "He needed me away from the kingdom's bond network before the pattern became visible to someone who could read it." Aldrich looked at her. His face was doing the thing she had seen it do once before, moving through its layers towards something that was not managed, not performed. Simply the naked expression of a man who has arrived at the full scope of what he has been part of without yet having any response adequate to that scope. He said, "He told me the collapses were instability." "Yes," she said. "He wrote the advisory reports. He framed every piece of information I received about you. He stopped. He used me. He used another stop, my willingness to accept convenient framings. She did not comfort him. This was not a moment for comfort. This was a moment for the full and unmediated weight of the thing to be felt. Because the full weight was what would determine what happened next. And she had spent too long watching people protect themselves from the full weight of things to deprive him of it now. They sat on the northern hillside in the dark with the evidence between them and Dremholtz. Recovered music below, and the Bond's ragged presence in the space where the distance had been. Then she said, "We need to go back to the capital." "Yes," he said. He stood, extended a hand. She looked at it for a moment, the specific offer of it unceremonious and direct. Simply a hand on a dark hillside, and took it, and he helped her to her feet. And neither of them let go for a moment longer than the standing required. The journey back to the capital took 4 days and produced 147 documented Bond disruptions. This was not what Emmara had planned to do with the journey. She had planned to rest. Her gift was running at the lower edge of its sustainable capacity after Dremholt. And the responsible course was sleep and food and the ordinary unremarkable hours of recovery that she had learned.
Thank you.
From years of mismanaging her gift were not optional. She had intended to spend the 4 days of travel doing nothing more demanding than existing on a horse in the cold air and allowing her inner frequency to rebuild itself quietly. On the first morning of travel, Aldrich had ridden ahead to the nearest territorial administrative office and returned with 2 scribes, young, serious, equipped with good paper and fast hands. He had not asked her first. He had arrived back on the road with them beside him and said, "You described the Bond breakdown map as a documentation. I thought you might want to make it one." She had looked at the 2 scribes, who looked back at her with the alert and professionally neutral expression of people who have been told something unusual is required of them and have decided to be competent about it. She had thought about her mother's letters, about the advanced practices she had never been taught and had been developing alone by necessity, by the slow accumulation of experience and error and the particular knowledge that came from doing a thing repeatedly until you understood it from the inside. She had used her gift for mending, for moving pain through systems and releasing it. She had never used it for sustained documentation, for holding Bond signatures present in her awareness long enough to be recorded without releasing them, maintaining contact with each pain signal as information rather than as something requiring immediate treatment. It was harder than mending. Mending had a clear direction: receive, redirect, release. Documentation required a different relationship with the received pain, a sustained and deliberate holding that went against the gift's natural inclination toward resolution. She had to actively resist the impulse to begin healing what she was holding, to maintain the clinical distance of a recorder rather than the engaged presence of a healer. She managed it. She had learned to manage most things her gift required through the same process: necessity, patience, and the refusal to stop simply because the first attempt was difficult. By the end of the first day, she had documented 41 Bond disruptions. The 2 scribes worked in shifts, one always recording while the other rested, their hands moving steadily as she described each signal, the location, the Bond pair's identifying information where the map provided it, the nature of the damage, the specific administrative order her map's timing data linked to the disruption's onset, the phase of the resettlement policy that had generated that order. The correlation entries were the most important. For each of the 41 Bonds documented on the first day, she could identify the specific administrative decision that had caused or directly triggered the damage and the date on which that decision had been implemented. The scribes recorded these correlations in a separate column, cross-reference to the policy documentation that Aldrich pulled from his traveling files with the organized efficiency of a man who had been quietly compiling evidence since the northern hillside. On the second day, she documented 53 more. By the third day, her inner frequency was showing the particular strain of sustained documentation work. Not the acute exhaustion of intensive mending, but a different quality of depletion, a gradual narrowing of available bandwidth, as though the sustained holding of pain without release was slowly filling a container that had no outlet. She ate more carefully, slept earlier, spent the midday rest stop in the complete and disciplined stillness that allowed her gift to partially recover between sessions. Aldrich noticed. He said nothing directly. She had observed that he had developed, over the weeks of working beside her, a sense of when speech was useful and when presence was the more adequate response. He simply adjusted the day's pace, slowing their progress to extend the midday stop, routing them through a village with a proper inn rather than camping at the roadside, so that she had a real bed for the third night. She noticed these adjustments and filed them in the honest part of herself that was building its account. On the fourth day, she completed the documentation. 147 bond disruptions, each one dated, located, identified, and correlated to a specific policy implementation, for years of systematic damage, organized now into a formal record that existed outside her awareness alone, that could be read by people who did not have her gift, that spoke in the language of dates and places and names that courts and councils understood as evidence. The capital came into view on the afternoon of the fourth day, its rooftops gray against a winter sky that was the particular flat white of days that hold their light without releasing it. She looked at it from the ridge above the southern approach and felt the familiar compression of returning to a place that had cost her something significant. Not dread exactly. More like the gathering of resources that you perform before entering a space where you will need them. Aldrich came to ride beside her on the ridge. He said, "Corvith filed an emergency petition 3 days ago. Davin sent a message to the way station at Brenhill." He paused. "He is petitioning to have your gift formally classified as a threat to pack sovereignty. The argument is that a single individual holding intimate knowledge of every bond in the kingdom represents an unprecedented intelligence security risk." She absorbed this. It was sophisticated. She could see its internal logic, could see exactly how it would be presented to a council that had been receiving carefully managed information for 4 years, not as punishment, but as prudent security policy, not as silencing, but as protection of the pack's intimate data from concentrated individual access. "The hearing," she said. 2 days, he said. "I could not delay it further without the delay itself becoming a political signal." She looked at the capital on its gray winter ridge. She thought about the 147 documented bond disruptions in the satchel behind her saddle. She thought about the assembly hall floor and the cold stone and the 3 pages read in a voice that had been practiced. She thought about what she was going to say in that hall in 2 days. Not the practiced version, the true one. "Then we have 2 days, she said. She rode toward the capital with the documentation at her back and the bond's persistent warmth beside her and her gift map quietly present in her awareness. The kingdom's suffering organized and named and finally, after 4 years of invisible accumulation, about to be spoken aloud in a room that could not look away. The quarters they had prepared for her were on the 3rd floor of the council building's east wing. She had declined the former queen's chambers without discussion. The administrator who made the offer had received her refusal with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed to expect it and had prepared a competent alternative, a working room with good south-facing light, a large table, adequate shelving, a sleeping pallet in the adjoining alcove. She had walked in, set her satchel on the table, looked at the light, and said it would do. It would more than do. It was, in its functional sufficiency, considerably more honest than anything the Queen's chambers would have offered. She spent the first day in the capital in the working room with the 2 scribes, organizing the documentation into the formal presentation structure that the hearing required, not simply a record of 147 bond disruptions, but a coherent argument, a sequential demonstration of the pattern that moved from individual cases through cluster analysis to the territorial distribution and finally to the policy correlation, building the picture incrementally in the way that evidence needed to be built for people who were encountering it for the first time and needed the architecture of it to be visible before they could assess the structure. The legal scholar Aldrich had arranged, a woman named Tef, precise and unsentimental, with the particular intelligence of someone who has spent decades learning how institutions think in order to argue more effectively against them, worked beside her through the day and into the evening, shaping the documentation into the formal language of council proceedings without losing the human specificity that made the individual cases something more than data points. This was the balance Emmara had insisted on. The numbers needed to be precise and the argument needed to be airtight, but inside the numbers were people, the bonded pair in Cethran's Valley. the grieving couple in Dremholt's eastern district. The elder in the Northern Territory, who had been transmitting into empty space for 40 years, and the people needed to remain visible inside the argument. Because arguments without people in them could be filed and forgotten, and arguments with people in them could not. Tef left at the 10th hour. The scribes left shortly after. Emmara sat alone at the large table in the working room with the organized documentation in front of her, and the south-facing window dark behind her, and the capital's night sounds coming through it, muffled and indistinct. The city doing its ordinary nighttime business, entirely unaware that something was being decided in a working room on the 3rd floor of the council building's east wing that would require it to reorganize several things it had considered settled. She was not afraid. She examined this with honest attention, looking for the places where what she was calling equanimity might actually be suppressed fear or performed composure. She found neither. What she found was the specific solidity of someone who has spent weeks doing the work. Real work, costly work. The kind that produced real outcomes in real people, and has arrived at the confrontation from a position of genuine competence rather than desperate hope. She knew what she knew. She had documented what she had documented. The hearing tomorrow was not a petition for mercy. It was a presentation of evidence. And the evidence was comprehensive, and she was the most qualified person alive to present it. She heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, familiar. The particular cadence she had been learning to recognize without needing the bond to identify it, though the bond told her anyway with its warm and persistent certainty. She called his name before he knocked. A pause. Then the door opened. He looked at her across the room with the expression she had been cataloging since the farm gate, the one that had been developing through the weeks of the Southern Road and the cluster work in Dremholt and the 4 days of documentation. Accumulating layers of something that was more specific and more honest than anything she had seen from him in the year of their bonding. He had been becoming someone, she thought. Not a different person. A more complete version of the person who had always been present beneath the managed surface. The one she had occasionally glimpsed in unguarded moments and had not known how to reach. He sat down across from her at the large table. Not beside her, he still observed the distances. The careful and mutually understood gaps that acknowledged everything without demanding it be named. But the table between them was covered in the documentation they had built together, which was its own kind of proximity. He said, "How are you?" Not how is the preparation. Not are you ready for tomorrow. Simply, how are you? In the voice of someone asking what they mean rather than what is socially expected. She thought about this seriously. "I am tired," she said. "And I am clear." Both of those are true simultaneously. She looked at the documentation on the table. "I know what I am going to say tomorrow. I have known since the northern hillside. Really, the documentation is simply the form the knowing needed to take before it could be spoken in a room that requires that form." He nodded. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about tomorrow." She waited. "I will not be at the head table," he said. "I have recused myself fully. 3 independent arbiters will conduct the proceeding. I will be in the gallery." He paused. "I want you to know that this is not distance. It is the opposite. I am removing myself from the position of authority over the proceeding because the proceeding needs to be yours. And being in the gallery means I am simply a witness. A member of the pack, present in the hall. Watching what the hall does with what you bring it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it with the specific precision of someone using the words for something they actually mean rather than as social currency. The room was quiet around them. The documentation lay between them on the table. 147 lives organized into the formal language of evidence. And outside the window the capital moved through its night, and the bond hummed its steady warmth, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to remain unsaid was present in its absence, acknowledged and patient. Then her gift map activated. Sharp, directional, close, inside the capital, within the council building's perimeter, a bond being deliberately severed right now. In the specific way of a forced rather than consensual dissolution. The signature of someone using institutional pressure to end a bond against one party's will. She was on her feet before she had decided to stand. He was already at the door. The great council hall held 300 people when formally convened. It was formally convened. Every seat was filled before the session opened, not with the usual administrative attendance of council proceedings, which drew officials and representatives and the small professional audience of people whose work required them to monitor governance, but with the broader and more unpredictable attendance of a city that had been following the events of the past weeks through its informal information channels and had decided, collectively and without coordination, that this particular proceeding was something it needed to witness in person. Southern villagers who had traveled north. Bonded pairs from the cluster territories who had made the journey specifically for this. Elder Mavn in the front gallery row arrived the previous evening, having apparently decided that her advisory role required physical presence at the events her advice had helped set in motion. Corin was in the gallery beside Mavn, which had required a 3-day journey from the southern border territories and which she had made without, as far as Emmara could tell, mentioning it to anyone in advance. The hall smelled of cold stone and the particular collective attention of 300 people who have come to see something true. Emmara sat at the witness table. Corvitha's legal representative opened the petition proceedings with the articulate fluency of someone who has prepared extensively and believes in his argument. The representative was not Corvith himself. Corvith had not appeared in the council building since Aldrich's return from the south, his absence noted and not yet formally addressed. The investigation into his conduct running on the parallel track that Aldrich had set in motion from the road. His representative was a senior legal advocate named Brath, who presented the sovereignty classification petition with the sophisticated precision of a man who had identified the argument's strongest form and was delivering it in that form without equivocation. The argument was this: bond sense, as documented in the Northern Archive texts and as demonstrated by Emmara Ashvile's actions over the past weeks, constituted the comprehensive accumulation of intimate pack intelligence in a single individual, the location, identity, condition, and history of every bonded pair in the kingdom. This was not simply a medical gift. It was an intelligence capability of unprecedented scope. No governance structure existed to oversee such an accumulation. No legal framework addressed the privacy implications. The classification of bond sense as a sovereignty concern was not punitive. It was prudent. It was, Brath argued, the responsible response of a governance system to an unprecedented situation. It was a good argument. Emmara had known it would be. She had been turning it over since Aldrich told her about it on the capital's ridge, examining its structure, identifying its load-bearing points and its vulnerabilities, preparing not a counter-argument, but something more effective than a counter-argument. A demonstration. When Brath finished, the chief arbiter invited Emmara to respond. She stood. She did not begin with the documentation. She began with a question she directed at the hall rather than the arbiters. Not a rhetorical question, an actual one. Addressed to the 300 people in the seats with the direct simplicity of someone who trusts an audience with the real content. She asked, how many people in this hall are currently carrying bond pain that they have never told anyone about? The hall was silent. She waited. Then slowly a hand went up in the middle gallery. Then another. Then 6 more. Then more than she could count. Hands rising across the 300 seats with the tentative and slightly stunned quality of people performing an action they had not planned to perform. Responding to a question that had reached past their prepared defenses and found something true underneath. She looked at the raised hands for a moment. Then she said, I have known about every one of you since I walked into this hall. Not because I am a sovereignty risk, because I am a bond sense practitioner. And this is what bond sense is, the capacity to feel what is already present in the room, what has always been present in the room. What your governance structures have been organizing themselves not to see for 4 years, while a senior advisory official used administrative policy to make it worse. She opened the documentation. She did not read all 147 entries. She read 10. She chose them with the specific intention Tef had helped her develop, cases that were individually specific enough to be human and collectively varied enough to demonstrate the pattern's breadth. A bonded farming family in the Eastern Territory, separated by the first phase of the resettlement policy, their bond damaged beyond natural recovery within 6 months. A bonded pair of cooperative administrators in the Northern District, relocated to opposite sides of the new territorial boundary in the policy's second phase. Now in the physical decline stage her map had flagged. A young couple in the southern border territories, bonded for less than a year when the third phase relocated one of them. Their bond calcifying with the particular speed of new bonds stressed before they have had time to develop resilience. She read each entry in the plain and unhurried voice of someone presenting evidence, not performing suffering. She let the specificity do the work. The hall did not make sound for a long time after the 10th entry. The particular silence of 300 people receiving something that requires the reorganization of prior understanding. Sitting with the weight of it, the real weight of it, which was not the weight of statistics but the weight of people described accurately. Then she presented the territorial distribution map, the correlation table, the policy implementation timeline cross-referenced against the cluster cascade dates. She said, "This is not a convergence of pre-existing stressors. This is a documented program. For years, 11 territories, 147 confirmed disruptions, one policy, one architect." She set the documentation on the arbiter's table. She sat down. The chief arbiter looked at the documentation for a long moment. Then he looked at Brath. Brath had the expression of a man who has arrived at a hearing prepared for one proceeding and is finding himself in a different and considerably more consequential one. In the gallery, Aldrich stood. He did not speak immediately. He stood as a member of the hall, in the gallery among the witnesses, in the clothes he had been wearing on the southern road, and he waited until the room's attention had fully oriented toward him. Then he spoke without the managed cadence of royal address, simply in his own voice, which was steady and without performance. He said, "I sat at the head table of this hall 6 months ago, and I read a dissolution declaration that I had practiced until I was satisfied with its delivery. I did that while my senior advisory official was systematically dismantling PAC bond networks across 11 territories for political purposes, using the advisory reports he controlled to ensure I received only the information that served his program. I did not ask enough questions. I accepted convenient framings. I exercised the authority of my position without the responsibility that authority requires." He paused. He said, "The sovereignty risk in this hall is not the woman who can feel what is happening to the people in it. The sovereignty risk was the man who used that authority to decide which suffering was politically convenient to address and which was more useful ignored. The hall received this in the same silence it had received the documentation, not the silence of shock but the silence of 300 people sitting with something that was simply and completely true." Then the side door opened. A security officer entered with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate moment and has decided the moment has arrived. He crossed to the chief arbiter and spoke quietly. The arbiter looked up. Corvith had been found attempting to leave the capital through the eastern gate with a traveling case. The case had been searched under emergency security provisions. It contained correspondence, private letters between Corvith and representatives of 3 external political interests, all of them from territories that stood to benefit from the fracturing of the kingdom's internal PAC bond networks. All of them dated across the 4-year period of the policy's implementation. All of them using language that was not the language of administrative policy, but the language of a coordinated and compensated program. The hearing was adjourned to an emergency tribunal, effective immediately. In the front gallery row, Elder Mavin set down the cup of tea she had been holding throughout the entire proceeding, and looked at Emmara across the hall with the comprehensive and unhurried expression of a woman who has lived 93 years and has learned to recognize the moments that will matter when they are happening rather than only in retrospect. Beside her, Corin was crying quietly with the specific dignity of someone who does not cry easily and has decided that this occasion warrants it. The tribunal took 6 days. Corvith had been thorough in his preparations for flight, and considerably less thorough in his preparation for the possibility that flight would fail, which meant the traveling case contained more than he had apparently intended anyone to find. The correspondence with the external political interests was comprehensive and self-documenting: dates, amounts, specific policy instructions. The particular explicitness of written communication between people who had believed themselves permanently beyond accountability and had therefore not bothered with the indirection that prudent conspiracy requires. The legal advocate Teff took one look at the contents of the traveling case and said, With the precise satisfaction of a
message you
woman
left.
who has spent decades building arguments and
Is
recognizes
this
a
true?
preponderance of evidence
Yes,
when
my
she sees
lord,
one,
every word.
that the tribunal was going to be straightforward
I
and that its
understand.
outcome was not in meaningful doubt.
Show me the window.
What required care was not the conviction itself, but the institutional reckoning that needed to accompany it. The formal acknowledgement of the structural failures that had allowed Corvitha's program to operate for 4 years without detection, and the legal foundation for preventing their recurrence. Emmara testified on all 6 days. She had not expected to be needed for the full duration. She had prepared for 2 days of testimony, possibly 3. By the end of the first day, it had become clear that her documentation was not simply the primary evidence in the Corvith case, but the foundational record of a kingdom-wide harm that the tribunal needed to fully map before it could adequately address. And that mapping required the person who held the map. She testified without notes, which surprised the arbiters and did not surprise Tef. The documentation was precise because her gift was precise. She did not need to consult the written record, because the written record was a transcription of something that was still fully present in her awareness. Each of the 147 bond disruptions, as specific and located as it had been on the northern hillside, when she had first seen the whole pattern from sufficient distance to understand its shape. She described each category of disruption with the clinical accuracy and the human specificity she had insisted on in the documentation's preparation. She described the cascade mechanism, how bond damage transmitted through the PAC's empathic network and damaged adjacent bonds, how a single administrative decision affecting 14 families had produced 37 damaged bonds in Dremholt, how the policy's architects had understood this mechanism and had used it deliberately to amplify the damage beyond the direct impact of the relocations themselves. She described the physical health consequences of long-term bond damage, naming the 11 individuals she had found in physical decline, providing the specific symptom profiles that her gift's bond health readings had produced, explaining in the precise language she had developed over years of solo practice what severe bond damage did to the body over time. On the third day of testimony, Elder Mavn appeared at the back of the hall. She had not been scheduled to testify. She had not announced her intention to be present. She simply arrived, in the gray of the Northern Elder tradition, and sat in the back row of the tribunal hall, and remained there for the duration of the third and fourth days without speaking, her dark eyes moving between Emmara at the witness platform and the arbiters at the judgment table, and the documentation spread across the evidence table with the comprehensive and unhurried assessment of someone who is evaluating not only the proceedings, but the institutions conducting them. On the 5th day, the tribunal heard testimony from 17 of the bond disruption victims, bonded pairs from 6 territories who had traveled to the capital specifically to speak. They were not legal witnesses in the formal sense. The chief arbiter had made a procedural decision, after the 4th day of Emmara's testimony, that the tribunal record needed to include the voices of the people the documentation described. That evidence without the testimony of the affected was an incomplete accounting of the harm. It was an unusual decision. Tef had argued for it, and Emmara had been grateful in the specific way she was grateful for things that required effort to achieve. The 17 pairs spoke in the plain language of people describing their own lives. They spoke about the relocations and what had followed, the distance, the slow quality change in the bond, the physical symptoms that had been attributed to other causes, the particular and grinding despair of watching something essential to your daily existence deteriorate without understanding what was happening or why. 2 of the pairs had been mended by Emmara during the exile months. They spoke about that too, about what the mending had felt like, about the quality of before and after that was the most direct evidence available of what the disruption had actually taken from them. Corvith was convicted on the 6th day on 7 counts, the most significant of which required the tribunal to first formally establish bond integrity as a protected interest under PAC law, which they did with the specific and somewhat stunned efficiency of an institution recognizing a gap in its own framework in real time and moving to address it. The conviction was not the ending. It was the beginning of the work. Emmara walked out of the tribunal hall on the 6th evening into the cold winter air and stood on the steps for a long moment. She was more tired than she had been since Dremholt. Not the acute exhaustion of intensive mending, but the sustained depletion of 6 days of testimony. of holding every one of the 147 bond disruptions present and articulate and human across 6 full days of formal proceedings. She heard boots on the steps behind her. She did not turn around. She heard him stop beside her, felt the bond's warmth in the cold air, heard the particular quality of his silence which she had become, over the past weeks, fluent in reading. She said, "Elder Mavin caught me in the corridor after the conviction. He waited." She said, "She told me my mother would have approved." She needed a moment after saying this. She stood with it, with the specific weight of those 6 words carrying everything they carried, her mother's letters and the market square at 4 years old, and the advanced practices never taught, and the collapses and the exile, and the 6 weeks of quiet work in the southern villages and the northern hillside, and the 6 days of testimony, and let it move through her with the same patient process she used for everything that needed to move. He did not speak. He stood beside her in the cold, and let her have the moment in its full dimension. When she was ready, she said, "The bond protection accords. I want to begin drafting tomorrow. I have the framework outlined. I need legal scholars, territorial representatives, and someone who can translate bond health concepts into statutory language without losing their meaning in the translation." She paused. Tef has agreed to lead the legal drafting team. 2 of the testimony pairs have offered to serve as community representatives. I need 6 territorial representatives, 1 from each affected territory, with preference for people who have direct experience of bond disruption rather than administrative credentials. "Done," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I have not finished." Something in his expression shifted in the way it did when he was containing something adjacent to amusement. "I know," he said. "Done means the obstacles between you and what you are describing will not come from my direction. You may continue." She looked at him for a moment with the specific and honest attention she gave everything she had decided to trust. Then she turned back to the winter evening and continued. She described the 9 provisions of the bond protection accords in the precise and organized form they had taken in her mind over 6 days of testimony, each provision building on the documented failures the tribunal had exposed. Each one designed not to prevent the specific thing Corvith had done but to address the structural conditions that had made it possible. The independent oversight body for administrative bond impact assessment. The mandatory community consultation requirement for any policy affecting residential distribution of bonded pairs. The formal recognition of bond healer practice as a protected and supported profession. The privacy framework for bond health information that addressed the legitimate concerns in Corvitha's sovereignty argument while inverting its purpose, protecting individual bond information from institutional misuse rather than protecting institutional authority from individual knowledge. And the Bond Registry Council, the permanent, independent body with 12 representatives drawn from every territory and designated rank, with authority to review any administrative decision with potential bond integrity impact before implementation, governed by the accords rather than by any single political authority, answerable to the pack rather than to the crown. He listened to all of it. The winter evening deepened around them, the capital's lights coming on one by one in the cold dark. And he stood beside her on the tribunal steps and listened with the full and unmanaged attention that she had decided was one of the things she trusted most about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Bond Registry Council. I want to sit on it." She looked at him. "As one vote among 12, she said. "No greater authority than any other representative. Subject to the same accountability provisions as every other member." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She studied him in the lamplight from the tribunal hall's entrance. She thought about the farm gate in the southern valley. She thought about the northern hillside and the hand on the dark path. She thought about the documentation they had built together on a 4-day road and the 6 days of testimony, and the way he had stood in the council hall gallery and said, in his own voice without performance, what he had done and what he had failed to do. She thought about the ragged edge of the bond, which was not ragged tonight in the same way it had been ragged on the assembly hall floor. It was still incomplete, still healing, still carrying the mark of what had been done to it, but it was warm. Consistently, persistently warm, in the way of something that has found its direction and is moving, slowly and without rushing, toward wholeness. She said, The first drafting session is at the 8th hour tomorrow. Do not be late. He said, I will be there at the 7th hour. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and walked down the tribunal steps into the capital's winter evening. And for the first time since the assembly hall floor, she was walking toward something rather than from it. And the difference was everything she had spent 6 weeks learning it could be. Aldrich watched her go. He stood on the tribunal steps in the cold and watched her until she turned the corner at the end of the avenue, and then he stood there a moment longer. And the bond's warmth was the steadiest thing in the winter evening. The Bond Registry Council deliberated for 3 days. Emmara did not watch the deliberation. She was in the drafting room with Tef and the 6 territorial representatives and the 2 scribe teams. Working through the final language of the bond protection accords with the focused and productive urgency of people who understand that the window between a tribunal conviction and the political reorganization that follows it is the moment when structural change is most possible, and that this window does not stay open indefinitely. She knew the deliberation was happening. She could feel it through the bond, not its content. She had no access to the council chamber's proceedings. But the particular quality of Aldrich's attention during the 3 days, which was the quality of someone sitting with something significant and receiving it without trying to move it. She had learned to read that quality precisely. She trusted what she read. The accords were finished on the 2nd day of deliberation. 9 provisions, final language, territorial consensus on all 9 after 2 days of productive friction that had resulted in 3 provisions being strengthened beyond her original draft, and 1 being restructured to address a practical implementation concern raised by the Eastern Territorial representative that she had not anticipated and acknowledged was correct. This was the thing she had told herself about the drafting process from the beginning, that her knowledge of what needed to change was real and comprehensive, but that her knowledge of how to change it in ways that would actually function across 11 diverse territories required the people who lived in those territories. She had held this conviction honestly throughout the drafting, which meant the final accords were better than anything she could have produced alone. Tef had looked at the final document and said, "This will hold." Coming from Tef, this was the equivalent of a considerable celebration. On the 3rd day of deliberation, the Bond Registry Council sent its ruling to the formal record. The ruling was read publicly in the Great Council Hall by the chief arbiter of the original tribunal, in the same hall where the dissolution declaration had been read 6 months ago. Emmara sat in the gallery. She had chosen the gallery deliberately, the same way Aldrich had chosen the gallery for the hearing, because the ruling was not being made for her benefit, and she did not want the hall to read her presence at the center of it as though it were. The ruling was precise and comprehensive, and had clearly been drafted by people who had taken the 3 days seriously. It found that the public dissolution declaration constituted an act of administrative harm to PAC bond integrity under the principles that the tribunal had established and the accords had codified, specifically, that a formal witnessed dissolution conducted in a setting designed to maximize institutional pressure on the separation violated the principle of bond sovereignty. The right of bonded individuals to make decisions about their bond without coercive institutional context. The ruling formally entered this finding into the kingdom's legal record. It could not undo the breaking. No ruling could. But it named what the breaking had been, with precision and without qualification, in the permanent record of the kingdom's legal history. It also established a precedent. Any future bond dissolution conducted under conditions of institutional coercion, formal settings, witness proceedings, declarations prepared and delivered by figures of authority, would be reviewable under the bond protection accords. The assembly hall proceeding that had broken Emmara's bond would not be repeatable without legal consequence. The hall received the ruling in silence. Then Aldrich entered. He came through the main doors, not the side entrance that connected to the council building's official corridors. He walked down the central aisle of the great hall in the plain clothes he had been wearing throughout the past weeks of travel and work, without the crown that had been sitting on its stand in his study since the day Elder Mavin's session ended. And he walked to the center of the hall, the same geometry Emmara noticed from the gallery, the same equidistant point between the 4 witnessing pillars where she had stood 6 months ago, and he stood there while the chief arbiter finished reading the ruling's final section. When the reading was complete, Aldrich spoke. He said, I accept this ruling without qualification or appeal. He said it in the specific tone of someone stating a fact rather than performing a position, which was the only tone the moment deserved, and which she had been watching him develop across the weeks of the Southern Road, and the cluster work, and the 4 days of documentation, and the 6 days of testimony. The slow and genuine development of a man learning to say what he meant rather than what was strategically optimal. He said, I will be signing the Bond Protection Accords as the first legislative act under the new framework. Then I will be submitting my application to serve as one representative among 12 on the Bond Registry Council, subject to the same selection process and the same accountability provisions as every other applicant, with no guarantee of selection and no appeal if I am not selected. A pause. The hall was very still. He said, I would also like to formally apologize to the PAC for the public dissolution declaration, not as a political statement, as a member of the PAC acknowledging a harm done to the PAC's integrity. The person I harmed most directly is not this hall's to receive an apology on behalf of. That apology belongs to her alone, and I will offer it to her in whatever form and at whatever time she considers appropriate, if she considers any form appropriate. He stopped. He did not look at the gallery. He had not looked at the gallery once during the entire statement, which she understood was deliberate. He was not performing this for her response, not angling for visible forgiveness, not managing the hall's perception of his sincerity by watching her face for confirmation. He was simply saying what was true in the hall where he had done the thing, and leaving it to stand without seeking anything from it. She sat in the gallery and felt the Bond's warmth in her chest, which was different tonight from how it had felt on the assembly hall floor, and different from how it had felt at the farm gate, and different again from the northern hillside. It was fuller, slower, moving with the particular quality of something that has been healing steadily without being rushed, and has arrived at a state that is not the same as what it was before the damage, but is not lesser than it either. Different, as healed things are always different, carrying the mark of what it had survived, but also the specific and durable quality of something that has been through difficulty and remained. She waited until the hall had emptied, or nearly emptied, before she came down from the gallery. He was standing near the 4 witnessing pillars, in no particular hurry, with the patient stillness of someone who had decided to wait as long as waiting was required, and had made genuine peace with the duration being uncertain. She crossed the hall floor and stopped in front of him. She said, I heard you. He looked at her. The directness of it, unmanaged and complete. The full attention she had been cataloging since the farm gate, present now in its most unguarded form. She said, the apology. I heard it. She paused, taking the careful time the next words required to be said with the precision they deserved. I am not ready to say that the harm is resolved. Harm like this does not resolve on a timeline that can be declared. But I want you to know that I have been watching you across the weeks since the Southern Road. Watching how you have been, not what you have said but how you have been, and what I have seen is a person doing the work rather than performing it. That distinction matters to me more than any declaration. He was very still, listening with everything. She said, I also want you to know that the bond is not what it was. It cannot be. What it is now is something that has been through damage and has been healing slowly, and she paused, is becoming something I think I want to tend carefully, rather than simply observe from a careful distance. He reached out, slowly, with the specific deliberateness of someone who is not assuming an outcome but is making an offer. He held his hand open between them, not taking hers, simply offering, the same gesture from the northern hillside, the same unceremonious and direct quality of it, asking nothing, simply present. She looked at his hand. Then she placed her hand in it. Through the bond, healing, warm, carrying its marks and its history and the specific durable quality of something that has been through difficulty and remained, she felt what she had felt on the northern hillside, but fuller now, steadier. Hope, genuinely offered. And beneath it, quieter and more fundamental, the thing she had been waiting to feel with certainty before she named it. The hall was very still around them. She looked up at him. He looked at her. She said, the Bond Registry Council's first full session is in 3 weeks. I need you confirmed as a representative before then. The selection process takes 10 days. You should have submitted your application yesterday. He said, I submitted it this morning. She said, Of course you did. And
You
for the
are
first time in the
safe
great
here.
council hall, where he had read a 3-page dissolution declaration in a practiced and memorized voice, where she had lain on the cold stone floor with the
Thank
weight of the
you.
kingdom's hidden suffering filling her completely. Something that
The
was not
gold
performing anything
sits
at all moved
heavy.
across both of their faces
It
simultaneously.
should.
They walked out of the hall together through
Does
the
it
main doors
change
into the winter
anything?
evening,
No.
her hand still in his.
Not for the
The
working
bond warm
man.
and healing between them, and the capital going about its ordinary nighttime business all around them, entirely unaware that something in the hall behind them had just been, quietly and completely made whole. 1 year later, the Bond Registry Council chamber had a window that faced east. Emmara had specified this during the building's
The
renovation,
silence
east-facing.
of this place is
She had told the architects,
unbearable.
because east was where the light came from first.
We have
And the council's
lost
work was the
too
work of
much,
finding
Your
things that had been in the
Majesty.
dark and bringing them into visibility. And she wanted the room to remember that every morning before the session began. The architects had looked at her with the expression that architects sometimes wore when a client's requirements were more symbolic than structural, and had made the window exactly as she described, large and east-facing. And on the morning of the first full session of the new year, it filled the chamber with the particular clear light of a winter sunrise. Honest and without warmth yet, but entirely without pretension, the light of a day that was only beginning. She stood at the head of the table and looked at 12 faces. They were not all the faces she had imagined when she had first described the Bond Registry Council to Aldrich on the tribunal building steps. Some of them were better. The Eastern Territorial representative was a bonded man of 60 who had lost his bond to the resettlement policy's first phase and had spent 14 months in physical decline before Emmara's exile work had reached his
The
territory.
message you
He had
left
testified on the tribunal's 5th day with the
Is this
plain
true?
and devastating specificity
Yes, my
of someone
lord,
describing their
every
own
word.
diminishment. And he had agreed to
I
serve on the council
understand.
with the specific purposefulness
Show me
of a
the
person
window.
who has decided that surviving something obligates you to prevent its recurrence. The Western provincial representative was a woman named Adara, a bond healer of partial gift who had been practicing without formal recognition for 30 years, whose application to the new bond healer credential program had been the first one submitted, whose knowledge of her region's bond health landscape was deeper and more specific than any official record. She had arrived at the first session 20 minutes early and had reorganized the document distribution system before anyone else entered the room, because she had been waiting 30 years to sit at a table where her knowledge was the qualification, and she was not inclined to waste any of the time she had earned. Corin represented the southern border communities. She had accepted the nomination with the specific gruffness of someone performing reluctance while actually being entirely prepared. She had arrived in the capital 2 days before the
Please, Your
session,
Majesty.
had inspected the council chamber, had asked
I
4 pointed questions
understand
about the
now.
decision-making process, and 2 about the provision governing conflicts of interest, and had
There
pronounced
is
the framework
no
adequate with the air of
preparation
someone who had
for
been
this.
expecting to find more faults and was mildly disappointed.
hereby
She had then
declare,
produced a
under
list
the
of 14
authority
bond disruption
vested in
cases
me,
from the
that
southern
you are
border
stripped
territories
of your
that had not been
rights and
included in the
banished
original
from this
documentation
realm.
because they had occurred
This
after the
decree is
documentation's
final
completion,
and absolute.
and had handed it to Emmara with the matter-of-fact efficiency
I
of someone
bear
who has
witness
decided
to
that a
the
seat at the
fall
table
of
means
my
bringing the table
house.
everything the table needs. Elder Mavin was not on the council. She had declined, as she had indicated she would, on the grounds that advisory roles suited her better than administrative ones. She was in the gallery, which had been built into the council chamber specifically at her suggestion, a public observation gallery, glass-walled, accessible to any member of the pack who wished to observe
It
the
is
council's
done.
proceedings, because Mavin had said, with the comprehensive precision of 93 years of watching institutions operate, that transparency was not a feature to be added to governance
So it
structures,
is.
but a foundation to be built into them from the beginning, or not at all. She was in the gallery now, in the front row, with a cup of tea. Aldrich sat at the table as one vote among 12. His selection by the council's independent review process had been confirmed 8 days after his application, which was 2 days before the deadline, which meant there had been deliberation. He had received the confirmation without comment, had shown up to the orientation session that all new council members were required to attend regardless of their other credentials, and had sat through 4 hours of procedural training with the attentive patience of someone who understands that the procedures are the point and that treating them as a formality would be its own kind of failure. He sat now in his assigned seat, third from the end of the 12. In the middle of the table's long side rather than at its head, and he looked at the east-facing window with the morning light coming through it with the expression she had learned to recognize as his genuine attention. The one without management or performance, simply present with what was in front of him. In the corner of the chamber, in a basket lined with a blanket that Corin had knitted during the 3-day journey from the southern border, and had presented with the specific gruffness of someone performing an absence of sentiment, Emmara's son was sleeping. His name was Ren. She had not announced the name before he was born. Had simply presented him to Aldrich in the recovery room with the name already decided. And Aldrich had said it once quietly, and then had not said anything for a long moment. And she had watched his face move through the understanding of who the name was for, and had seen it arrive at the same place her own had arrived when she chose it. The specific and sustaining warmth of honoring something that deserved to be honored. Ren was 4 months old, and had opinions about most things. He had expressed a strong opinion about the basket that morning, and had been persuaded into it only by the combined efforts of Emmara, Aldrich, and Sable, who had arrived at the chamber an hour before the session to organize the document distribution, and had taken a brief detour into baby management with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything. Sable was the Bond Healer Academy's youngest student, and was completing her first year with the specific academic intensity of someone who has been waiting for the correct curriculum her entire life, and intends to make full use of it. She had submitted 2 written observations to the Academy's research journal in her first term, both of which had been accepted. The second of which had been accompanied by a note from the Academy's deputy administrator, saying that the observation challenged a methodology that had been considered settled, and that this was exactly what the research journal was for. She had received this note with the equanimity of someone who had not doubted the observation and had simply been waiting for the institution to catch up. She had taken her apprentice healer position at the council chamber for the day with the same equanimity, which meant she was currently standing at the corner of the chamber's side table with her notebook open, recording observations that had nothing to do with her assigned task and everything to do with her actual interests. The Bond Healer Academy in the Eastern Territory had completed its first term with 43 students, 3 of whom had manifested previously unrecognized Bondsense gifts during the term's practical work and had been referred to the Sanctuary for advanced training. The Sanctuary, adjacent to the Academy, had received 11 practitioners in its first months of operation, people who had been carrying unusual empathic gifts in isolation for years, without framework or support or the simple and essential knowledge that what they experienced was real and had a name and had a history and had a community now. The community was small. It was growing. Emmara called the session to order. The 12 representatives settled into attention with the specific quality of people who have been selected for a purpose they take seriously and have come prepared to take it seriously in practice as well as in principle. She looked at the agenda: 4 bond impact assessments of pending administrative decisions, 2 new bond healer credential applications, 1 request from the Northern Territories for council guidance on a community resettlement proposal that had been submitted voluntarily for review rather than under compulsion, which was the thing the mandatory review provision had been designed to eventually produce, and which had arrived sooner than she had anticipated. She noted the voluntary submission without comment in her session notes. She would comment on it later to Aldrich. In the specific and honest way she commented on things that mattered to her, and he would receive it with the full attention she had come to rely on. And they would sit with it together the way they sat with most things now, present, patient, neither of them alone with it. The session ran for 3 hours. At its end, when the 12 representatives had gathered their documents and exchanged the specific collegial shorthand of people who had been working together towards something real, when Corin had produced 3 additional case files from her traveling bag and handed them to the session recorder with the air of someone completing a transaction that was entirely within the scope of her responsibilities, when Adara had made 2 observations about the credential application process that would require the process to be revised before the next application cycle, Emmara stood at the east-facing window. The winter light had moved across the floor during the 3 hours of the session, the slow angle of it shifting as the morning progressed, and it lay now in a long oblique band across the worn stone and the edge of the document table and the corner where Ren's basket sat. Touching the blanket Corin, had made with the particular impartiality of light that does not distinguish between the significant and the ordinary, but illuminates everything with the same patient honesty. She heard Aldrich's footsteps behind her. She did not turn. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked out at the eastern city together, the rooftops and the winter sky, and the first movement of the capital going about its morning. Ordinary and specific and alive with the particular aliveness of a place that does not know it is being looked at and is therefore simply itself. Through the bond, healed now, carrying its history and its marks and the specific quality of something that has been through damage and has become. In the healing, more honest than it was before, she felt the steady warmth of him beside her. And beneath that, in the wider awareness of her gift, the vast and quiet hum of the kingdom's bonds. Hundreds of them in the capital alone, thousands more across the territories, most of them healthy. Some of them newly formed with the particular brightness of bonds chosen freely, and with full knowledge of what choosing a bond meant, and what it required, and what it was worth. Some of them still damaged, still healing. Still on the long road that her maps had documented and her hands had begun to address, and that the academy and the sanctuary, and the 12 people who had just spent 3 hours in this room were now, systematically and without hurry, continuing to address. A few of them, here and there across the kingdom, newly discovered, gifts like hers. Partial and full, waking up in people who had been carrying them without knowing what they were. Now findable because there was a name for them, and a place that recognized them, and a woman who had built that place from the ground up, and would be receiving their letters and responding to every one of them personally. She closed her eyes for a moment and simply listened to all of it, the full range of it, the damaged and the healing and the healthy and the new. The whole vast and human complexity of what bonds were and what they cost and what they made possible when they were chosen freely and tended carefully and protected by structures that understood their worth. She felt Aldrich's hand find hers. She did not open her eyes. She simply held his hand in the morning light and let the bond be what it was, honest, healed, hers and his and freely chosen, carrying everything it had been through as history rather than wound, present in the fullness of what it had become rather than haunted by what it had once survived. From the corner, Ren made a sound of opinion about the length of his morning nap. Corin, who had not actually left, said from behind them, "I have him." Emmara opened her eyes. She looked at the eastern light on the city. She looked at Aldrich beside her, who was looking at her with the expression she had stopped trying to find an adequate word for and had simply decided to receive. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Not because she needed to. She was not a woman who needed to. She had crossed the southern border territories alone with a gift that no one understood and had mended 47 bonds before anyone who held authority came to find her, and had built a legal framework from evidence she had compiled in her own awareness and had testified for 6 days in a hall that had once watched her fall and had stood on its floor again and spoken without asking anyone's permission. She did not need to lean against anyone. She chose to. And in the choosing, fully aware, fully herself, knowing exactly what she was choosing and what it had cost to arrive at a place where the choice was freely hers, she felt the thing she had been building toward through all of it. Not an ending, not a resolution. Something quieter and more durable and more honest than either of those. A life that was exactly the right size for everything she intended to put in it. And she intended to put a great deal in it. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.